years of performing and speaking and whatnot, and a lot of times you can tell how significant something's going to be by the number of barriers that are thrown up. And the evening that we just had getting up here has been quite crazy. So I'm really excited because I have a feeling tonight is going to be extremely, extremely amazing evening. And so I'm really excited about that. Before I get started, I've been told that there's still some people in the back that need to find seats. So if you guys could maybe squish in and fill up any empty seats that are in the middle so that if there's some people along in the back that can get in, that would be great. This is a good problem to have. It's great to see so many people out here on a wet and stormy. And it's getting cold. I don't know what's up with that. I was ready for the spring. I don't know about you guys. Just give it a second to let everybody get settled. Well, as Michael Bolton said, my name is Mike Meharry, and I'm the Communications Director at the 10th Amendment Center. And normally when I speak, I talk about political theory and constitutional principles and the fundamentals of liberty and things like that. Tonight I get to do something a little bit different. Basically, my job tonight is just to tell you guys a little story. When Michael first asked me to kind of take up this part of the program and tell this story, I thought, yeah, that'd be cool. It'd be something different to do. But as I really got into it and began studying and reading and connecting with the characters in this story, I got really, really excited because I realized that this is an amazing privilege that I have. Because tonight what I get to do is I get to give a voice to a man who really never had what you would call a voice. And I get to bring a story to light that it would be very easy to have fade into the dark background of history. I'm sure most of you are familiar with the phrase, those who do not know history are doomed to repeat it. And I think that's very, very true. And as you hear this story, there's going to be a lot of things that you're going to hear that are going to say, yeah, we definitely do not want to repeat this part of history. The dehumanization that took place within the institution of slavery is sickening. But we need to remember that because it shows what the human heart is capable of. But I think there's also a flip side that's true. I think sometimes we also need to remember our history so that we do repeat certain things. So that we do continue to hold on to timeless principles. And so that we do repeat actions and acts and take up causes that are good and right. And I think this story has as much that we want to carry forward with us as things that we want to avoid in the future. We don't know a whole lot about Joshua's first 36 years. As a slave, he never learned how to read or write. So we don't have any of his recorded words or his written thoughts to fall back on. And quite honestly, it's very difficult to trace the history of any slave. At this point, we can't even call him Joshua Glover. We can just call him Joshua because he wouldn't have even had a last name. Only people got last names. And in the minds of most of society, Joshua Glover wasn't a people. He was just a piece of property. So we really don't know anything at all about his first 36 years, except for the fact that we do know that he was born into slavery. But he never knew for those first 36 years of his life freedom. But interestingly, we do know exactly where he spent the last few days of 1849. He would have been in St. Louis, in what they called the pen. I'm not going to say what they actually call it because it's rather offensive. But basically, it was a holding area where slaves were brought and held prior to the slave auction. And Joshua was sold on New Year's Day of 1850. So he would have spent those last few days, New Year's Eve, possibly even Christmas, in a slave pen. There was a preacher named Bernard Lynch. That was not the preacher's name. The man who owned the auction house was named Bernard Lynch. And a clergyman went and visited his slave pen and wrote about what it was like. Joshua would have spent those few days in a single room, not very large. There was one window high up in the ceiling that would let in a little bit of light. The floors were dirt. Furniture consisted of 3 wooden benches with no backs. Men and women were kept in here together with no provision made for privacy. There was no real bathroom facility. And this preacher said that when he went into the pen, there was one woman there about 40 years old who got down on her knees and tearfully begged him to buy her and take her with him, that she would be good and faithful. Can you imagine what it must have been like to have been beaten down to the point that you would beg somebody to purchase you? I can't fathom it, but that was the reality for Joshua in those days. Like I said, he was sold on New Year's Day, and the man that bought him was a man named Benjamin Stone Garland. Slave auctions, as they're described, were probably one of the most demeaning things you can ever imagine. And as I was reading the accounts of the slave auction, it kind of brought me back to something that I remember when I was growing up. And like Michael said, I grew up in Lexington, Kentucky, and still live there right down the road. And like a lot of kids in Kentucky, I spent several summers working on a horse farm. And one of the years that I was working there, the guy that owned the farm took me with him to Keeneland for the spring yearling sales. And I remember the first thing that impressed me when we got there was all of the fancy cars in the parking lot. You know, there was the Mercedes and Porsches and sports cars that any 17, 18-year-old kid would envy. And we went inside, and there was a lot of people milling around and horses out and about. Most of the people were well-dressed and obviously well-heeled. And they moved between the horses and would poke and prod and touch and examine. And that's a whole lot like what a slave auction was like. The people would have come who were going to purchase slaves in the nicest carriages that money could buy. They probably would have been nicely dressed, because owning a slave wasn't just about labor. It wasn't about just having somebody to work your land. It was a source of prestige, a source of pride to have this type of ownership. And Benjamin Stone Garland was no exception to this. He was a very, very wealthy man. He had a farm about 4 miles west of St. Louis. He had 300 acres, which was quite a spread in those days. He grew corn, oats, potatoes. He had an orchard, dairy cattle. He also happened to have 3 other male slaves, all much younger than Glover, and 2 female slaves. This is where Joshua would spend the next 2 years of his life, basically doing whatever Mr. Garland told him to do. At this point, he still doesn't have a last name. If anything, he might have been referred to as Garlands Bully. For 2 years, he spent working and learning. You know, slaves had a reputation of being not real bright. In fact, that was something that was perpetuated by slave owners, another way of keeping them dehumanized. And for the slave, the way that they had to function kind of lent credence to this, because they had to keep their heads low and keep their mouths shut and feign ignorance. But in truth, they were really quite intelligent and very good at intelligence gathering. Within those 2 years, Joshua would have known pretty much everything there was to know about the Garland family. The kids, the wife, the comings, the goings, the operation of the farm, he probably could have run that farm. And he would have known that right across the Mississippi River was a town called Alton, Illinois, which was well known as an escape point for slaves. At some point, we don't really know why, Joshua decided he'd had enough of being in bondage. Now, it's easy for us sitting in here that have spent our lives here in the United States and lived our lives in freedom. It's easy for us to think, well, hell yeah, I'd be out of there on the first chance I got. But when you really think about it, it took an amazing amount of courage just for him to take this step to seek his freedom. Because all he had ever known was bondage. He didn't know any different. And I think human nature, a lot of times we're willing to accept something that's not quite so good when we fear what might be coming. Somehow, Joshua overcame this. And one night in 1852, it was March, so early spring, probably still quite chilly, he made his break. He would have known that there was a barge that was in the Mississippi River. It was used as a school for black children. It was also a hiding place for slaves. And deep in the dark of night, sometimes they would move this barge over closer to the Illinois side of the river. One night, Joshua was on this barge, and it was moved over to the edge of that river. And for the first time of his life, he stepped off of that barge onto free soil. Can you guys imagine what must have gone through his mind when he looked back and saw Missouri, slave soil behind him, and saw freedom in front of him? We don't have any way of really knowing, but I think if it was me, I would probably drop to my knees and look up at the sky, maybe painted with a canopy of stars just like is over us right now, and thank God for freedom. We do know one thing, he certainly looked up at the stars, because for any black person that was held in slavery, they knew that the North Star was a beacon of freedom. And they would look for what they called the drinking gourd to point them to that North Star. We call it the Big Dipper. So it's pretty certain that he would have looked up into the stars, looked at that North Star, and started heading north. We don't really know quite how long his journey north took. We do know that he traveled 350 miles on foot, mostly at night. A fugitive slave could average maybe 10, 15 miles a day if they were quick. Somebody later on reported that they had spoken with him about his escape, and Joshua said a friendly farm woman had given him a few seed potatoes, and that served as food. He also mentioned that he went 3 days without. Can you imagine traveling, hiking over that distance with just the clothes on your back, not eating for 3 days? It's pretty amazing. They figure it probably took him 6 to 7 weeks. At that point, we know that he arrived in a little town on the shore of Lake Michigan in Wisconsin called Racine. It was built around the Root River. And at this point, we tend to think of the frontier as being like the wild, wild west in Texas and whatnot. But at this point in history, in the 1850s, Missouri, Wisconsin, that area, that was pretty much frontier. So he settled in this little town called Racine. There was about 500 people there. There was a handful of black people, a mix of some freed slaves and some black people that had been free their entire lives. I'm sure he would have incorporated himself quickly into that community. A man named Duncan Sinclair hired him to work at his mill, and for the first time in his life, he got paid for his labor. He still would have had to work from can't see to can't see, but he would have made about 50 cents to $1 a day. And he also got himself a little shanty next to the river. Probably not much of a life by our standards, but he was free. He wasn't free from prejudice necessarily. We have this maybe impression that once they got up in the North, they were free from all the bigotry and that. And that's not true. He was still commonly called a darky. Probably discriminated against to some degree, but he was able to hold a job, he was able to earn a living, and he was free. And he managed to stay free for about 2 years, but his freedom would have had a cloud over it that whole time. He would have always been looking over his shoulder because, as Michael mentioned, returning a slave back to its master was the law of the land. And year after year, the federal government passed more and more draconian laws to basically force people to return slaves south. So he always had to be on his guard. He always had to be on the lookout. Always had to be worried that maybe somebody's going to bang on his door and come in and carry him back south. And unfortunately, his fears were well-founded. Because Garland was not a man to allow his property to go without tracking it down. And he was able to figure out where Glover was. He went to a judge in Milwaukee, a federal judge named Andrew G. Miller, who will play a central role in this evening. Miller would have received an affidavit. Garland would have swore that he owned Glover, and at that point Miller would issue a warrant for Glover's arrest. But like any good story, there's a true villain that really this person probably bothers me more than anybody else in this story. His name is Nelson Turner, and he was supposed to be Glover's friend. They shared a lot in common because Nelson Turner was also a freed slave from Natchez, Mississippi. But for whatever reason, Turner didn't really value freedom, at least not somebody else's. And he betrayed Joshua, who would now be Joshua Glover, by the way. He had a last name now. One night, it was probably a Friday night. In fact, we know it was a Friday night by the newspaper accounts. Turner shows up and knocks on the door of Glover's shanty, and he has a bottle of whiskey and a deck of cards. Invites himself in, and they start playing. I think Glover was probably a little wary because there was rumors that there were slave catchers out and about. So they're playing cards, drinking a little whiskey, having a good time, when all of a sudden there's a ruckus outside of the door. And then all of a sudden, a crash at the door. Turner jumps up. He runs toward that door. Glover yells, "Don't open it until we know who's there." But it was too late. Turner was in on it. Turner flings the door open. Garland rushes in with 3 other men. Garland's got a gun in his hand. Glover grabs for the gun. Crack! A marshal. His name's Cotton. Cracks Glover over the head with a pair of handcuffs. Glover staggers. Another man hits him in the face with the butt of a whip. Glover falls to the dirt floor. He's dragged out, bloody, bleeding, thrown in the back of a wagon, his head between the knees of his former master, now master once again. Garland decided that it wasn't wise to stay in Racine. Racine was a hotbed of abolitionist activity, so he took off towards Milwaukee, which was about 25 miles away, with Glover bleeding in the cart. Word got out fast. There was a newspaper editor there in Racine named Charles Rice. And he reported to the editor of the Racine Advocate that Glover had been, quote, kidnapped. This newspaper editor immediately telegraphed a newspaper editor in Milwaukee named Sherman Booth. You're going to hear a lot about Sherman Booth as the night goes on. He was the editor of the Milwaukee Free Democrat. He was a good journalist. The next day he set about trying to find out the facts. He tracked down Marshal Cotton. He was the one with the billy club handcuffs. Cotton basically lied, said, "We didn't catch no slave." He tracked down the judge. The judge wouldn't say anything either, but Booth was a pretty resourceful fella. And he at least managed to find out that Glover was being held in the Milwaukee jail. So he set about getting the word out, and he passed out a handbill. I'd like to read it to you because it's kind of gives you a feel for the sentiment of the people in Wisconsin about slavery. It says, last night a colored man was arrested near Racine on a warrant of Judge Miller by Deputy Sheriff Cotton, and making some resistance was knocked down and brought to this city and incarcerated in the county jail. Marshal Cotton denied knowing anything about it at 9 o'clock this morning. The object evidently is to get him a secret trial without giving him a chance to defend himself by counsel. Citizens of Milwaukee, shall we have Star Chamber proceedings here? And shall a man be dragged back to slavery from our free soil without an open trial of his right to liberty? Watch your jail, your district and U.S. Commissioner courts. So word spread quickly. In Racine, word also got out. Bells tolled, and it said that the largest gathering in that town square in the history of the town happened that day. 100 people were gathered together, and they decided that they were going to issue a warrant for Garland and Cotton's arrest on the charges of assault. And they got together 100 men who were going to go to Milwaukee, find Garland and Cotton, and drag them back to Racine to jail. Now this is pretty significant stuff because, you know, Cotton is a federal marshal. And you don't just go around arresting federal marshals. But they didn't care because they saw an injustice. And they risked their own lives and their own reputation and their own freedom to stand up for this former slave that had become a member of their community. Back in Milwaukee, by Saturday afternoon, Booth was making the news public. He went around town crying out, "Free citizens who do not wish to be made slaves or slave catchers, meet at the courthouse square at 2 o'clock. By 2:30, there were 3,000 to 5,000 people gathered in front of that courthouse. That's a lot of people. Can you imagine if the AP was there? The AP story would read, a handful of people showed up today in front of the courthouse. 3,000 to 5,000 people, and I'm telling you what, the crowd got rowdy quick. There were speeches, one after another, stirring up abolitionist sentiment. They called out the militia to try to control the crowd. The militia looked at it and go, "Nuh-uh." One company showed up and he dismissed them as soon as he saw what was going on. By about 5 o'clock, the folks from Racine showed up in town. That got everybody stirred up anymore. Nobody really knows what exactly sparked it, but all of a sudden the crowd surged forward towards the jail. They kicked open the outer doors. Another group of men grabbed a pickaxe and actually hacked their way through an outside wall. Others started demanding, "We want the keys, we want the keys, set this man free." A man named James Angrove, he was a mason. He picked up a 6-inch diameter beam from a nearby construction site, and he was heard to say, "Here's a good enough key." Sure enough, the men seized the battering ram, broke down the door, and moments later emerged with Joshua Glover in their midst, head still bandaged and scabbed up from being clocked over the head. They say that the procession out of Milwaukee was like half parade, half escape. People were rushing around trying to touch him and shake his hand, and he was grinning and waving at the crowd. He was heard several times to scream hallelujah. They made their way out of Milwaukee unmolested. They got to a prominent bridge and they transferred him over to a speedier wagon driven by a guy named John Messenger. And I think John Messenger may be the most interesting character in this story, because they say that John Messenger had absolutely no history of activism. In fact, he was described as, quote, "a rabid Democrat changed in a night to a rank abolitionist." For some reason, he decided that he was going to be the man who would take Glover to the first stop on the Underground Railroad, the first safe house. This man was pretty prominent. He had a pretty decent business. He had a wife and a family. And for some reason, he decided to risk it for this man. We don't know if he just got caught up in the emotion or if something clicked in him and he had a change of heart. But whatever it was, he said, "Come, we're going." And they took off at high speed. And ultimately ended up in a little town outside of, about 16 miles out of Milwaukee called Wakusa. It was also known as, quote, an abolitionist hole, because it was such a prominent anti-slavery area. They hid him in the house of a man named Winchell B. Bacon. He spent a night there. They got him cleaned up and fed. And over the next 2 weeks, he traveled over 100 miles, stopped in 7 different safe houses, and ultimately ended up about 20 miles from where he was originally kidnapped. Basically, they went in a big circle. But the whole object was to keep moving and keep the trail cold for the people that were chasing. Because believe me, Garland hadn't given up. Garland was not a man to give up. Several more weeks and 3 moves later, they got Joshua over to a warehouse on the shore of Lake Michigan. The men that owned that warehouse were sympathetic to the abolitionist cause, and they were known to sneak escaped slaves onto steamboats bound for Canada. Because you see, in Canada, a black man could be truly free. Not only on free American soil, but free from the specter of being drugged back south under the fugitive slave laws. We don't know what steamboat that Glover ultimately made it onto, but we do know he made it onto a steamship and made his very last part of his journey to freedom. And it wasn't any more pleasant than the first part. You know, it wasn't like they punched him a first-class ticket and put him up in a nice, comfy berth. He would have spent the 3 to 4 day wavy ride in the cargo hold, probably back in a corner hidden. He would have had to rely on some friendly faces to bring him food from time to time and empty the bucket that he used to relieve himself. But when his journey ended, he got off that boat, and he was truly a free man on Canadian soil. The first day that he shows up on any kind of records in Canada was April 19th. And if you do the math from the day that he was captured to the day that he showed up in Canada, it was 40 days. And those of you here that have some maybe religious background or religious people, you know that 40 is a very significant number in the Bible. The Jews wandered in the desert for 40 days and 40 nights. Or 40 years, I'm sorry. 40 days and 40 nights was Noah and the rain. And the 40 days of temptation that Jesus went through in the desert before he began his public ministry. 40 was a significant number because it was completeness, and it's ironic and kind of interesting that it was a 40-day journey for Glover to his freedom, to his ultimate goal, to the completion of that which he probably sought all of his life. He spent the rest of his life in Canada. He ended up working for a man named Thomas Montgomery. Montgomery owned several inns and some property, and he rented out Glover a nice little home. There's a lot of records that you can look back at, and you see what Glover was paid and when he bought produce, and he would buy things on credit and pay it back with his labors. He got married. We're not sure exactly when, but in the 1861 census, an Ann Glover shows up on the census rolls. It's interesting that Ann Glover was a white woman. And what was really interesting to me is that she was Irish. And in reading, I discovered that a lot of freed black slaves married Irish women. And the reason is that they had a common bond in discrimination and ill treatment. We don't know really if that was the bond that brought them together, but they were married for 12 years, and it was obviously a very close marriage because when she died, you can look at the records of his labor and work, and you can almost see where he went through a depression after his wife died. And I really just tell you this to kind of give you a feel that the rest of his life was pretty much what we would call ordinary. And yet I'm sure every day when he woke up, it wasn't at all ordinary for him because he wasn't in chains. He died in 1888. He was about 74 years old. And he died a free man. But you know, that freedom came at a cost. For Joshua, it came at a cost of 38 years of servitude before he ever tasted freedom. It came at a cost of a cold trek through Illinois and Wisconsin, and a cramped boat ride, and a lot of fear. But there was a lot of other people that helped him along the way, probably hundreds. And they paid a price. You remember our friend John Messenger who carried him to the first safe house? There's a recording that Messenger was overwhelmed with anxiety before he even got back to Milwaukee. He kind of wigged out, probably a "what have I done?" He drove to Racine and he stayed with friends. They say he paced the floor the entire night and refused to eat, worried about what was going to happen to him. And it turns out his worries were pretty well founded. Because in April, Garland served him with a civil suit for depriving him of his property. And in July, he was indicted on criminal charges for violating the Federal Fugitive Slave Act. 2 days later, John Messenger was dead. There's no obituary. There's no death record. We don't know what killed him. Historians speculate that it probably was what they call quote-unquote unnatural causes. We don't know if he was murdered. I kind of speculate that he might have committed suicide. Because basically he was looking at prison for his role in helping Glover to freedom. And then there's our newspaper editor, Mr. Booth, who did so much to stir up the crowds. He spent the next 7 years with legal wrangling. He was also slapped with a civil suit and a criminal suit. He was sentenced to a month in prison and a $1,000 fine. He served out his month in prison. For whatever reason, he was either unwilling or unable to pay the $1,000 fine, so he remained in prison. He also got slapped with that civil suit, and he ended up being charged $1,000 and $264 in court costs. They sold his presses in order to pay off his civil suit. He spent over a year in prison. Somebody finally talked him into petitioning President Buchanan to pardon him. But apparently he wasn't real good at humility, and his application for a pardon was really more of a defense of his actions. He said, he called it an unjust and illegal imprisonment and outrage on my rights and the rights of a sovereign state. He didn't get the pardon. He finally did, actually, Buchanan, as he was outgoing, finally got Booth his freedom. You know, I look at this story and I'm just amazed at the sacrifices that people were willing to make. I don't know how well, I can't see you guys at all, so I don't know how well you can see me. But how many of y'all have something like this, a lock on the inside of your house? I mean, it may not be a slide lock, but, you know, a deadbolt or a lock on your door. You remember when we were talking about Joshua first getting to Wisconsin and he had that little shanty by the Root River? We don't think of this as something very significant, not something that really comes into our head much unless we leave our keys inside when we're out. But I can't help but think that when Glover walked into that little house for the first time, and he closed that door behind him, and he slid that bolt and locked the door, that he must have been overwhelmed with a flood of emotion. Because you know what? Only a free man can have a lock on the inside of his door. Only a free person can lock the world out and have privacy inside their home. He risked his life for a lock on his door. And what's even more amazing is that Sherman Booth and John Messenger and 3,000 to 5,000 people risked their lives in freedom so that Joshua Glover could have a lock on the inside of his door. So I'm going to leave you with a question to ponder. What is your lock on your door worth to you? And take it a step farther and ask yourself, what is another man's freedom worth to you? Because we have to stand up for each other. When we submit, we lose not only other people's freedom, but ultimately we'll lose our own. And I want to close this little part off with a quote that I found. It's by another freed slave. You've probably heard of him, Frederick Douglass, who did learn how to read and write. And he said this: "Find out just what any people will quietly submit to, and you have the exact measure of the injustice and wrong which will be imposed upon them." Appreciate you guys' attention tonight.